Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. The biblical account of creation and the early history of mankind covered by the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is a pretty contentious subject. It is generally treated one of three ways, insofar as it gets thought of at all. Firstly, it gets treated as complete fact. This is the position taken by the young earth creationist lot, as personified by Answers in Genesis. The counterpart to this is it being treated as complete fiction. This is the position taken by most atheist debaters I've come across and famous hardliners such as Richard Dawkins. These two positions are actually two sides of the same coin, since they both treat the text the same way. It's just that one believes it to be literally true and the other literally false. Therefore, logically, Richard Dawkins and Ken Ham are actually the same person. The second point is that it can be treated as it's metaphorical in some fashion. Everyone else, and probably most Christians insofar as they think about it at all, tends to think about it this way. And then the last way is not thinking about it and assuming that it all works out in some fashion. Like it doesn't really matter, basically. Now, in my experience, the fourth way is the most popular with Christians in general. And for good reason, since the other three ways all have issues. If the story is false, then the Bible is not divinely inspired and Christianity is false. On the other hand, the preponderance of archaeological evidence suggests that it's not literally true either, since we can't accept that explanation. This leaves metaphor, which gives the obvious problem of Jesus coming and voluntarily suffering a violent and horrific death in order to pay for the penalty for a metaphorical sin, and also presents issues with the whole thing in Romans about Jesus being the second Adam. This doesn't work so well if the first Adam wasn't a real person. Fortunately, since the truth of Christianity does not revolve around the first 11 chapters of Genesis, but around the death and resurrection of Christ, the third option is actually viable. It's perfectly possible for a Christian to file the whole thing in the I don't know box of Christian theology and get on with life, trusting that it will all work itself out eventually. Personally, I find this approach dissatisfying. I would like to understand if and how the early Genesis account can in fact be reconciled to existing knowledge about the origins of the universe and the origins and prehistory of mankind. Now, the original plan for this was to make one video covering everything, or mostly everything, that I have to say about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, but the script got so long that I decided to break it down into a series. Just for reference, my videos work out at about 6 minutes per 1,000 words-ish, and a typical video script will usually be between 2,000 and 2,500 words. This script was reaching 6,000. So, yeah. Also, there was a Steam sale a month ago, and I finally got my hands on a game that I've been wanting for a while, so I've been busy, and that's why I've not made a video. I've done anything on Instagram for like a month and a half, and I haven't finished the Eli series yet. Anyway, so for this video, I've taken the introductory portion, which introduces and discusses the whole concept of what I'm going to be digging into, setting the scene for the detailed stuff to come a little bit later on. I've decided to call it divinely inspired mythology. Now, Kitchen calls it primeval proto-history in his book on the reliability of the Old Testament. That is, the part of the Bible that comes before Abraham, which is the start of the patriarchal period of the Old Testament, which comprises Genesis chapters 12 to 50. I recommend Kitchener's book, by the way. The book is by no means perfect. I don't think it's particularly well written from a readability point of view, and he somewhat stretches his case and his conclusions on occasion. But there's a lot of useful information in it, and I found it very helpful as a reference source and starting point for my own investigations into this topic and Old Testament history more generally. Now, of the 5 books traditionally attributed to Moses, which were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, the last 4 all take place during Moses' lifetime and are sort of more or less biographical-ish, with Deuteronomy, the 5th book, ending with Moses' death. The next book, Joshua, then deals with Joshua leading the Israelites. Now, while Genesis takes place before him, it is about the ancestry and origins of the Israelite nation from chapter 12 onwards. This is the previously mentioned patriarchal period. Genesis chapters 1 to 11 are explicitly not about the formation of Israel specifically, but about the origins of humankind in general. Moses obviously wasn't alive for any of this, so it's probably likely that although he authored the book, he was writing down some combination of Israel oral traditions and possibly incorporating some older historical texts and records, if they had any, as opposed to authoring it all in himself from scratch. Now, regarding history, my own opinion is that the appearance of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 is when Bible history properly begins. The story of Abraham and everything subsequent, regardless of how true you believe it is, and that is not a debate I want to get into here, is obviously meant to be read as a historical account, albeit from a very specific perspective. Everything happens at verified and recognisable locations. Events can have approximate dates attached to them, the cultures and nations involved are known and recognisable, etc. Events before Abraham, on the other hand, are less clearly defined historically and seem to me to be very clearly much closer to the genre of mythology. The timeline is much more vague, and it is difficult to map the stories to known historical cultures in the same way. The stories are clearly Hebrew in character, even though it's obvious they are not about Hebrews, who didn't exist yet. For example, Adam is a Hebrew name, and the story of Noah references clean and unclean animals, even though this concept originated with Moses. Which would make sense if it was Moses writing it down, and the audience he was writing it down for. The important point though, which is the main thrust of this video, is that the fact that it is mythological is not a bad thing. Although in modern times we usually use the word myth to mean fake, or made up. Fake news, this is not its true meaning, especially with regard to biblical analysis. According to Oxford University Press's A Dictionary of the Bible, the term myth covers those stories or narratives which describe the actions of the otherworldly in terms of this world, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. To quote Joseph Campbell, mythology is not a lie, mythology is poetry, it is metaphorical. It has been well said that mythology is the penultimate truth. Penultimate because the ultimate cannot be put into words. It is beyond words, beyond images, beyond that bounding rim of the Buddhist wheel of becoming. Mythology pitches the mind beyond that rim to what can be known but not told. The primary purpose of these stories is as a way of expressing supernatural significance by describing them in terms familiar to the experience of those listening, or reading, for that matter. Mythology is therefore a legitimate genre of literature. The Bible contains many genres, such as history, poetry, proverbs, prophecy, personal letters, and it is not unreasonable to accept mythology as one of them. The fact that the pre-patriarchal section of Genesis is mythological does not mean that it automatically has no historical applicability at all. It can still be correct in broad strokes, not true in one sense, but true in another. What do I mean by that? Well, consider this picture of an atom. This is from Wikipedia, but nearly all school science textbooks will have a picture something like this. This one shows a lithium atom, specifically. Now, almost every detail of this picture is scientifically incorrect. In reality, protons are not red. Neutrons are not black. And electrons are not blue. They are also much smaller compared to the nucleus and much further away. The overwhelming vast majority of the volume of an atom is empty space. They also do not orbit the nucleus like planets, but exist more as a diffuse cloud of probable positions. Electrons are sort of like particles, but also sort of not like particles and do all sorts of weird quantum things. In short, real atoms are almost nothing like this picture. However, in broad strokes the representation is true. Real atoms do have the protons and neutrons on the inside with electrons outside. A lithium atom does in fact have 3 protons, 4 neutrons and 3 electrons. Protons and neutrons are about the same size as each other and electrons are smaller, although a lot smaller than shown. While the image is incorrect almost in its entirety with respect to detail, from a very simplified viewpoint it is also true. In some ways it can be thought of as a lie designed to help reveal the truth. This kind of approach can be very useful. This image of an atom is easy to understand by anyone and does not require a great deal of pre-existing knowledge. More accurate images do exist, but they require a corresponding increase in pre-existing knowledge to be understandable. There is an inverse relationship, therefore, between accuracy and intelligibility. Ergo, the easier it is to understand, the less accurate it is, but the more helpful it is to more people. There is an inverse relationship between accuracy and intelligibility. Ergo, the easier it is to understand, the less accurate it is, but the more helpful it is to more people. My contention in this video is that the first part of Genesis can be understood in a similar way. Given that the Bible is written to be comprehensible by anyone, it makes sense that its approach to history will be similar, easy to understand and conveying the fundamental spiritual truth of the situation, but also inaccurate as regards specific physical details. When we couple this to the obvious fact that the further back in time we go, the scarcer and less precise the evidence becomes, therefore it becomes harder to verify even if it is physically true, we end up with a situation where the pre-patriarchal section of Genesis can be inaccurate or unverifiable in most of the specific historical events it describes, but also authoritative in its spiritual truth simultaneously. To go off on a slight tangent, an additional but related point that Christians believe, but almost everyone including Christians themselves misunderstands, is that Bible authors were authors, not stenographers. God inspired their words but did not dictate them, which is what Muslims believe about the Quran. Therefore, everything written in the Bible must therefore be understood to have been written according to the knowledge of, and from the point of view of, the writer. Though divinely inspired, the Bible did not come down complete from heaven, surrounded by singing angels on a golden cushion. It is a human book, written by humans, and over the centuries has been through the usual human procedures of writing, compiling, losing, finding again, copying incorrectly, debating, and error correction that all human books do. This goes against people's expectations of what they feel God ought to have done, or what they would have done in God's place. Incidentally, this attitude is partly behind the Muslim insistence that the Quran came down perfectly word for word from heaven and is perfectly perfect in every way. This means that when God inspired Moses to write about the creation of the world, Moses described it using words and in terms of phenomena that he was familiar with and his audience would also be familiar with. Hence, we have things like the first man named Adam and Noah taking extra clean animals for sacrifice, etc. The purpose of the story is the meaning of the relationship between mankind and God and what this means to Bronze Age Israelites, not the specific details of the events themselves. This is also why context is so important. The early chapters of Genesis have to be understood according to the culture and the time they were written in. What did they mean to the early Israelites? For example, an Israelite sitting and listening to the 7-day creation account would not be thinking, aha, Moses really showed Darwin up with that one. This is difficult and counterintuitive for the modern Western mind to understand because our culture and general outlook tends to lead to a laser-like focus on the physical/factual accuracy of accounts to the exclusion of all else, to the point where didn't physically happen equates to is a complete pack of lies. While this approach is great for engineering and science and is indeed one of the primary foundations of the Western domination of the sciences for the last few centuries, it is not so helpful when trying to understand other modes of thought. Suffice to say that if your main takeaway from the Genesis stories are questions about the logistics of feeding 10,000 animals on an ocean liner-sized wooden boat for a year, or the structural mechanics of building a skyscraper out of mud bricks, then you've completely missed the point. There is a lot more that can be said about this, which I will save for some point in the future because it's not the purpose of this series of videos, but I think I've made the point sufficiently for my purposes here. So, if it's mythology, and doesn't have to be true, why does the accuracy matter? The reason is that mythological is not the same as fictional, so saying that the first few chapters of Genesis are mythical is not a concession that it's all made up and shouldn't be taken seriously. As we said at the start, myth is basically a genre of history, where the priority for understanding is in something other than the accuracy of the narration of the specific events themselves. In the biblical case, on the spiritual and theological significance. Acknowledging this does not mean that the history doesn't matter, it simply places our expectations of the details of the narrative at the correct level. Having justified the idea that the early chapters of Genesis can be both divinely inspired and mythological, and thus put ourselves in the right frame of mind, we can look at the actual historical details behind the myths. It's been my experience that very few people actually sit and read the early chapters of Genesis to find out what the text is really saying. Generally speaking, the text is skimmed in order to use an argument, and that's about it. The much more interesting question of how it relates to known history, and how directly it does so, is often ignored. Speaking for myself, it turns out that when the text is read carefully, there are quite a few hints, tidbits and references scattered throughout that suggest an overall history that is much more nuanced and complex than the narrow perspective of the specific stories being told. These are very subtle and difficult to spot, but they are scattered throughout the narrative, often in throwaway verses in the middle of talking about something else. These little details make the account much more historically accurate than commonly suppose, acting in a sense as anchors that tie the stories to reality. In this series, we will go through these and look at some of the historical facts upon which the myths are based. The point being that mythical though they are, the Genesis account adheres far, far closer to known history than it's given credit for. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this series. Thanks a lot and take care. Goodbye.